It's also been recommended by a number of publications and reviewers, including Financial Times and Foreign Policy. She's won the prize, the International Convention of Asia Scholars Groundbreaking Subject Matter Accolade, and the Warren Samuels Prize for Interdisciplinary Research in History of Economic Thought and Methodology. The book has been widely reviewed to great acclaim. It's also attracted a lot of attention in the press. And if you go to the book website, you will read all of the amazing reviews and podcasts, newspaper articles, and so on there. Isabella is at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she's an assistant professor of economics and also the research leader for China of the Asian Political Economy program at the Political Economy Research Institute. Before joining UMass, she was a lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London. Isabella holds 2 PhDs. Some might say she's crazy. One in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York, and another in development studies from the University of Cambridge. And she's been a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. And for her undergraduate, she studied at the Free University of Berlin and at Peking University. She's given so many talks on the book, which seems to have attracted so much attention internationally. Recently, talks including at Princeton, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of California, Berkeley, Trinity College Dublin, Oslo, Campinas, Rio de Janeiro, Oxford, Goethe University, Cambridge, UCL, so many more. She seems to be doing so many book talks and interviews at the moment that I'm not sure whether she's finding time for anything else, and even for thinking about a second book. But this is her first book talk in Africa, or virtually in Africa. So we're honored and really delighted to be hosting you, Isabella, and thank you for making time for it. We're also happy to have Chris Kramer as a discussant on the volume, and he will make some comments after Isabella's talk. Chris is a professor at SOAS University of London, and he's a leading scholar internationally on African economic development. His most recent book is Economic Development in Africa, Evidence, Theory, Policy, which is co-authored by with John Sender and Akabi Okobai, and published by Oxford University Press. So we're looking forward to his comments, which will also include reflections on the relevance of the book for Africa in particular. So following Chris's comments and a short response by Isabella, we'll then open for questions and for comments. So please feel free to post in the Q&A function during the talk, and we'll come to them later. We also are live streaming on YouTube. So some people are watching there. Welcome to the people who are watching on YouTube, who unfortunately won't have the facility to post questions though. So thank you, Isabella, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Fiona, and thanks so much to Chris for agreeing to provide comments. The book has mainly been received in the context of the mounting US-China tensions, but really when I started this project, the motivation was also to study the history of development thinking in China, the recent history of development thinking in China. And as such, I'm thrilled to join you today virtually for the first time on the African continent, and in the context of a discussion that I hope will evolve around questions of development economics. So let me share my screen. Okay, so the title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. It is really a book about the 1980s, which I think of as a crossroads in the global economy. The 1980s is the beginning of China's economic convergence with the West in terms of its weight in the global economy. However, this convergence did not go along with the wholesale institutional assimilation of the Chinese economic system, even though China has deeply marketized. And I think that this tension between economic convergence, deep integration of China into the global capitalist economy, enabled by marketization, but without wholesale institutional assimilation, is part of what the what underpins the tensions that we are observing at the moment. The 1980s is also the beginning of a divergence, that is a divergence between Russia's fall and China's rise. The two giants of socialism of the 20th century are taking diverging paths starting in the 1980s. This is linked to a difference in economic policy. It is, of course, not reducible to a simple choice between economic policy A and B, and then simply Russia went wrong and China went right, and that's it. Of course, this is not what I'm arguing. But what I am suggesting is that the ways in which policy was designed did matter in the context of historical contingencies, a complex decision-making process, a complex process of historical change, in fact. So if we look at the outcome of reform in China and Russia, and we use a simple indicator, that is GDP and CPI, Consumer Price Index, we can see that in the case of China, consistently inflation was lower than GDP growth, with an exception in the late 1990s, which also was the most neoliberal period in China's development. In contrast, in the Russian case, we see a picture that is basically reverse. It is an explosion of inflation and a hyperinflationary period in the 90s that is so stark that one has to map this on a logarithmic scale, otherwise it wouldn't fit your screen. At the same time, GDP collapsed dramatically, which looks fairly mild in this graph because of the explosion in inflation, but was in fact a very, very sharp decline that came along with a deep societal crisis, enormous increases in mortality, and so on. So the outcome of reform could not have been more different if we look at these two simple macroeconomic indicators. It is fairly clear what the economic policy logic is that underpinned Russia's economic reform policy making. It's been commonly referred to as shock therapy. And on a basic level, shock therapy is a package of 4 policies, that is price liberalization aided by macroeconomic austerity, where macroeconomic austerity is meant to control the general price level and prevent price liberalization from inducing inflation. This is meant to be complemented with trade liberalization in order to integrate the newly created market economy into the global market, and finally complemented with privatization. Even the most die-hard shock therapists acknowledge that privatization and also trade liberalization would take time and would be processes of complex negotiation and institutional rebuilding. So the element of shock therapy that can be shocking and that can be implemented more or less overnight is really the big bang in price reform. On a more abstract level, shock therapy constitutes a way of thinking about marketization in terms of one unitary model of a market economy that is seemingly applicable all around the world, and tends to amount to a way of thinking about marketization where marketization is basically also Westernization, that is an institutional assimilation to Western institutions. In more economics terms, the market here is being thought of as the free movement of prices, where private property enables such a free movement of prices and enables actors to react to these free moving prices. We know that China has not implemented shock therapy of the type that I have just described. Of course, there were shocks in China's reform policy making. There were also drastic movements that did undermine the social welfare of certain groups of people and so on. So my point is not that there were no shocks. My point is that there was no shock therapy in the terms that I've just defined. We do know that China has pursued a form of gradualism and that experiments played an important role. But what I tried to do in the book is to shed some light on the intellectual foundations of China's reform approach. That is, what are the origins of China's specific path towards marketization? In the late 1970s, that is at the dawn of reform, there was clearly a great urge for reform. The revolution was, of course, about much more than simple economic development, but economic development was always part of the ambition of the revolution. Already on the 2nd of October, the People's Daily stated in 1949 that the ambition of the revolution was also to gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one. In 1978, that is just at the beginning of reform and opening up, Chen Yun, who was, along with Deng Xiaoping, one of the key leaders of the early move towards reform, stated, "It has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If this problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food." So clearly, in the late 1970s, the basic problem of, in the words of the People's Daily, leading China to escape backwardness and to lead it towards a quote unquote civilized and progressive industrial nation had not been achieved. To be sure, there were major breakthroughs under Maoism in the realm of public health, public infrastructure development, public education, and heavy industrialization. When Mao died in 1976, Hua Guofeng took over as his designated heir. Under Hua Guofeng, China attempted one last time a Soviet-style big push industrialization that was this time attempted to follow a so-called 10-year plan, where China was meant to import foreign technology, upgrade its production techniques, and finance this import of foreign technology with the export of petroleum. However, when the projected petroleum findings were not forthcoming, this plan quickly ran into a crisis and was reversed, since it could only have been implemented at the danger of foreign indebtedness on the part of China, which was something that the Chinese leadership was committed to avoiding. So by the late 1970s then, the revolutionary approach of late Maoism had failed, the attempt at a renewed Soviet industrialization push had failed, and the question was really, what now? How to recreate China's economic system in order to address the challenge of escaping what they, in their own words, were calling backwardness. In this context, it was very early on clear that markets should play a greater role in China's economic system. Already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping told a foreign journalist that saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? There was an ideological debate around the compatibility of socialism and markets. However, there was also a technical debate around the question of how to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy. My book focuses on this seemingly technical niche debate, which I'm calling the market reform debate, that is how to recreate markets in the context of a more or less centrally planned economy. Deng Xiaoping, in contrast to the Cultural Revolution, under which politics was meant to be in command, set economics in command. However, as Deng Xiaoping acknowledges in a speech in January 1980, that was titled "The Present Situation and the Tasks Before Us," a good number of comrades who were shunted aside for many years and haven't been back in their original post for very long have lost touch with the situation. Even those who stayed at their posts all through are confronted with new problems they find hard to grasp immediately. During the Cultural Revolution, economics as an academic discipline had basically been cancelled. So in the late 1970s, economics as an academic practice was only being re-established. The economics discipline as such was really reinventing itself in the most basic sense. So while it was meant to be in command, it was really still in a process of reconstitution. In this context, Chinese reform leaders referred back to China's own experiences with using markets as a tool. In one of the World Bank minutes that I consulted on a meeting in 1982, the note-taking World Bank official notes in his notebook, why do the Chinese answer to every question that they have to go back to the liberation period policies? And in fact, these liberation period policies, as I argue in the book, were an important reference point to the thinking about recreating markets in China's 1980s. So what are the market mechanisms or the ways in which markets played a role in the liberation period policies? This was a context of civil war when the communists were fighting the nationalists under conditions of ramping hyperinflation. Many say that the nationalist downfall, in fact, was not least a result of hyperinflation and their inability to bring inflation under control. The communists managed, through a practice of market participation, to control inflation in their liberated areas. They created commercial agencies that basically ensured that the currency that they issued would be exchanged against useful and essential things, and thereby would have a value. And as such, they used the market to stabilize prices and to reintegrate the economic territories that they were gaining, which ultimately was critical in them winning the Civil War. In fact, Chen Yun, the architect of the early Chinese reforms, already stated on April 7, 1950, that it is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily. And this slogan was coined in the context of the attempt at price stabilization just after the revolution. Now, this very same slogan, it is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily, has become probably the most famous metaphor in trying to capture the Chinese reform approach. In the 1940s, the communists were acting in a long-standing tradition of statecraft in China that goes back all the way to ancient times, where we can read already in the ancient text, the Guanzi, about principles of state market participation, where the idea is that economic and social stabilization can be achieved through the creation of markets by the state and the participation of the state in such markets. Thereby, the logic was to use what is heavy to shoot at what is light. In other words, to focus on stabilizing the most essential markets and thereby stabilizing and guiding the economy as a whole. This was based on a premise that suggested that it was necessary to conduct constant empirical assessment of concrete dynamics in order to enable state agencies to effectively participate in the market in a flexible way, adjusted to the conditions prevailing in every situation. With this in mind, let us return to the late 1970s. Reform in China really started from the countryside. So let us take a look how the countryside was organized in the pre-reform period. On the most abstract level, this was a system of people's communes, which I'm here depicting as little triangular shapes, where each people's commune was linked to the national economy via their delivery of quotas of essential agricultural goods, such as grain. In turn, central command authorities were setting prices at which these communes would have to deliver their output. These prices were set in a way that were to the disadvantage of the countryside in order to squeeze resources from the peasants for the industrialization project. Now, in the late 1970s, as the momentum for reform built up, what happened was that there were bottom-up initiatives of people suggesting that they could organize the production in agriculture instead of through the commune, through households, where every household would commit to producing their share in the quota, and then beyond the production for the quota would be producing for their own accounts and ultimately would be producing for markets. As a result of this, there was a peripheral emergence of market relations, while at the same time, this core link between the national economy and the countryside prevailed. This initially happened in areas that were minor agricultural producers that did not play an essential role for the national grain system. Later on, this policy was transferred to pretty much all of China, which resulted in a so-called dual-track price system in the countryside, where there was a state-set price and market prices for one and the same commodity. While this process started as a bottom-up process in reaction to the opening up at the center, economic research played a critical role in transferring the initial experiments into national policy. And in this context, in particular, young reform intellectuals who had returned from the countryside, where they had spent their youth during the Cultural Revolution, to the cities and to the universities, and who had started initiatives towards contributing to agricultural reforms, and were supported by key leaders such as Du Rongsheng, whom you can see in this picture here, but also, for example, Deng Liqun, who supported these initiatives of really students at the time to go out and survey the experiments in agriculture. Out of this movement that very quickly gained support from high up leaders emerged a force in China's reform discourse. These were people who were self-trained in Marxist classics, often in reading groups during the Cultural Revolution, often also including Maoist readings. In the late 70s and early 80s, they very quickly read up on all sorts of Western social sciences, but always stayed deeply rooted in the political economy of agriculture. They primarily drew their intellectual inspiration from empirical studies on the ground in China and elsewhere. So when the question emerged how to go about reforming the urban industrial core of China's economy, these people played an important role. Initially, a dual-track price system emerged more or less endogenously by letting it happen as a result of the agricultural reforms also in the urban industrial economy, since there was demand on the parts of rural people who now were producing for the market for cash for certain consumer goods from the urban industrial system. The socialist production units started to cater to that demand. As township and village enterprises emerged in the countryside, there was also demand for more upstream consumer goods. Now, the initial system that had prevailed before reform was one that was modeled based on the idea of one national workshop, where the price system was really a redistributive system across sectors and not a system that signaled to production units what kind of production decisions they should take. However, with the emergence of the second track, the market track, suddenly a different kind of logic of operation was emerging within the system. The big battle in the early 80s was whether or not to foster and systematize this system that was emerging more or less spontaneously, or whether to suppress it and to establish some other kind of reform approach. In this context, a conference in 1984 that summoned young economic researchers from across China played an important role, since they came up with a proposal that suggested that the dual-track price system could in fact present a reform mechanism for China's economic system reform. In 1985, the dual-track price system became national policy, and Zhao Ziyang, the prime minister in the 1980s, who was absolutely critical for the creation of China's economic reforms, summarized this policy to local cadres. He emphasized that this did not only mean letting go of inessential commodities and reforming and adjusting the price management system for important commodities, but that it also meant Sun participating, that is, in his own words, after having enlivened prices by letting them go in the market to regulate the prices as in the first years after liberation. So that was that for sectors where prices were allowed to fluctuate on the market, the range of the fluctuations should be limited by market participation. Conversely, the state should have stocks to be able to add supply to the market when the prices were rising too high and purchase when the prices were falling too low, and to import goods as an emergency balance. This is basically the exact same logic as the ancient granary system under Chinese statecraft. Incidentally, the same logic is also being mobilized again as we speak in the coal sector in relation to the stabilization of coal prices and electricity prices. On the other hand, there was an alternative reform approach that emerged as economics as a discipline was being re-established. Key members of this group were middle-aged established intellectuals who often had an orthodox socialist training in Soviet economics in the 50s and 60s, who were the first to study modern economics in the United States and England. They were joined by engineers and young scientists and drew their intellectual inspiration from the interwar socialist calculation debate and its repercussions in the socialist world, Eastern European immigrant economists such as Bruce Schick and Kornai, as well as monetarists such as Milton Friedman and Gregory Chow. In this context, the World Bank played an important role as an organizer of exchanges between Eastern European immigrant economists and Chinese economic officials, who at the time, by the way, were still called economic workers. They thought of the Eastern European immigrants as ideal ambassadors of mainstream economics at the time, since they were intimately familiar with the latest neoclassical economics, however, at the same time, knew the challenges and the language of socialism. The only one of the Eastern European immigrants whom I still got to interview in my oral history interview project is a man named Peter Kende, who is sitting in the first row, the second from the right in this picture. When I met him in a coffee shop in 2017 in Paris, he was wearing the exact same outfit that he's wearing in this picture. And he told me, this is obviously considerably later, by the time he was an old man. And he told me that he had treasured that outfit and preserved it since it was such a bold move to go to China in 1982, at a time where he would have been arrested at the border upon return to his native Hungary. I think this illustrates just how bold the Chinese were in turn in inviting immigrants who were considered dissidents in their own countries to advise them on one of the most critical questions of economic system reform. Out of this broad tapestry emerged a critique of the dual-track system that suggested that the dual-track system would create friction and contradiction, and in fact, an irrational price system that was worse than the pre-reform system. It would also create a dynamic towards inherent rent-seeking and corruption. So therefore, China would be best advised to first reunite the two tracks, impose tight fiscal and monetary policy in order to stabilize the price level, and then let go of all prices in one big push, or at least as fast as possible. Importantly, let go of the most upstream core industrial prices and replace market participation by the state with indirect macro control, while implementing at the same time a wage and tax reform. This, in its essence, is the same logic as what later came to be called the Big Bang. On the other hand, the dual-track reformers criticized this approach by suggesting that it would create cost-push inflation, since upstream goods had been priced artificially low in the pre-reform system and were bound to shoot up. And since the production units did not face a tight budget constraint, they would simply be handing down price increases to the next production unit in the chain, which would eventually result in a wage price spiral and an uncontrollable inflation that would undermine China's ability to conduct reforms without, however, creating a functioning new economic system. The core of the debate was not whether or not to let go of inessential downstream goods, but the core of the debate was whether or not the state should keep control and participate in markets for the most essential upstream goods. In 1986, China came close to implementing such a Big Bang program. It was initiated by Premier Zhao Ziyang himself. However, he reversed that plan when he received reports from dual-track reformers who surveyed the experiences in Hungary and Yugoslavia during a 6-week study tour and warned against such a Big Bang along the lines that I have just illustrated. In 1988, tensions within China, 1 decade into reform, were mounting. Many in the leadership who had initially supported reforms thought that reforms were going too far, whereas in the population, people realized that not everybody stood to benefit from reforms. In this context, Deng Xiaoping tried to rescue his reform legacy and suggested to push ahead with price reform. In fact, he adopted then on, ironically, June 4th, 1988, pretty much the same language that has become famous in the context of shock therapy. That is, he said, long-term pain is worse than short-term pain, and argued for a quick liberalization of prices. In August, the Politburo passed in principle a plan for price and wage reform, which was announced on state TV, but the reactions to this plan were so violent, there were bank runs and panic buying all across the country, that the reform course towards such a price reform was reversed. In late 1988, Milton Friedman makes a last appearance in China in the 80s, trying to argue once more for price reform. However, at this point, the window of opportunity for economic advice had closed. Reform was temporarily on hold, while inflation was still relatively high by Chinese standards. And the tension between the reversal of reform and the increase in inflation, I think, is an important background to the events of 1989 from an economics perspective. So in conclusion, why was China's policy choice not the Big Bang, but the dual track? Leaders were not prepared to risk the survival of the communist state and endanger their vision for long-term development. The Big Bang seemed to promise a scientific solution to economic system reform, yet was found not to create a viable market economy while undermining the core of the plan. The dual-track system gradually emerged as a policy alternative through experimental reliance on techniques of market creation by the state, distinguishing between essential and inessential goods, and relying on a systematic assessment of the concrete economic conditions and dynamic. Despite all its shortcomings, the dual-track system provided an alternative that allowed China to ultimately reverse its plans and not implement a Big Bang. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Isabella. It's amazing how you were able to pull out from the book, which in itself is obviously based on a vast amount of research, some of the key messages, and distill them, I guess, drawing on all the many book talks you've been doing. So thank you very much. Let me hand over to Chris for his remarks.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks, Fiona, and of course, thanks, Isabella, as well. So Fiona gave me 3 rather big questions she wanted me to talk about. What's important about this book? What are its implications for development economics? And what are its implications for Africa? And I'm not sure I can do justice to the book or to those questions, but just to say a few things, and a lot of them really emphasizing points that Isabella has made. I do want to say this really is a fantastic book, and I never thought I'd use the word gripping to describe a history of debates about price policy, but that's really what this is, this book, complete with superb set pieces like the boat conference, the Bashan, I'll probably say all these things wrong, floating along the Yangtze River, with World Bank economists, Janos Kornai, and others, debating price theory and policy for 5 days in 1986. And as Isabella said, what matters here is this is not a story pitting reformers against anti-reformers. It's about very, very fierce debates amongst people who knew there needed to be quite fundamental reform, but wanted to very different ways of bringing that about. And although we know at least some of the outcome, it's edge of the seat stuff. China came very, very close in the mid to late 80s to a very different direction. And I guess later on did to some extent. I think it's interesting how, as outsiders, not people like Isabella, but people like me who maybe don't know nearly enough about China, we tend very easily to have in mind to see an all-powerful regime and a monolithic communist party in China. But one of the things we get some more insight into through this book is we learn a lot about the divisions within the party over time. And we see something very important, which is maybe more than many of us had realized, how seriously Chinese leaders have taken their own public legitimacy. And we'll maybe come back to that. Another thing I want to emphasize is the history of economic ideas in this book. This is a history of ideas, but we get different layers, not just the 1980s against the backdrop, as Isabella said, of the 40s, but we get the deep history of thought on prices and on welfare in China itself, going back to debates in what, 4th century BC and earlier, the Sultanayan debate, the Guangzi. And we also get, more recently, a comparative history. We get the history of US price fixing in the Second World War, also in the UK, and experiences in the UK and elsewhere with managing a shift out of wartime into post-war conditions. And I think all of that history serves as a corrective to a very narrow idea that all sensible ideas about markets and states come from Western modern economic thought. And it helps us show how American and European policy officials and economists have, especially during and after wartime, had themselves to grapple in very pragmatic ways, very slightly messy ways often, with managing prices administratively. Again, correcting for a narrowness of economic imagination that may be all too common nowadays. So what are the implications? Well, rather crudely and most obviously, one is ditch the textbook. I think Isabella is making the argument that policy officials and economists should beware of thinking from and with ideal types. And orthodox economics is over-attached to the ideal of a perfectly competitive market against which we judge every real outcome and policy. And its method is built on behavioral axioms that we're all increasingly realizing are way too unrealistic. And instead, this book is about the triumph of evidence and experiment over abstraction and ideal targets. It's a warning against tough love economics, against the idea that you have to put in place the right set of preconditions first, which may involve some healthy, even if extreme pain, before you can then wonderfully grow. And the Chinese experience in a way is putting growth and welfare first, that through pragmatic and experimental policies, this groping for stones to cross the river. And in this, maybe, I don't know whether you'd agree, Isabella, I think there's something complementary with another story of Chinese escape tricks, and that's Yuanyuan Ang's book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. And that book's very much about how markets and institutions have co-evolved in China in ways that, again, defy textbook narratives of putting in place the right, so-called right institutions first. Just think of the finally, thankfully shamed Doing Business Index. And incidentally, Yuanyuan Ang at the end of her book also has a nice story, a version of which we tell in our own recent book, about the growth in institutionally less than ideal conditions of the Nollywood film industry. But what shines through in obvious and less obvious ways in this book is the importance of evidence for policymaking. Chinese leaders, as Isabella said, sought evidence from very interesting experiences abroad, going on study tours and so on. And they pursued this strategy within China of seeking truth from facts. But to me, what's especially interesting is the way in which this debate was shaped by Chinese economists' experiences in rural China, Many of the reform economists had been sent by Mao to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, some as punishment. But there they came to develop a real understanding through observation of rural lives and society. And many of them undertook careful research surveys in rural China. And that came to prove hugely important in the 1980s in crafting policy experiments and the dual price system, as she explained, as well as the household contracting system. And I think there really is something in there to provoke people. How many economists these days, African or international, have done careful rural fieldwork? How many policy officials have had that kind of experience? And to what extent does the general preference amongst many young economists for technical prowess with secondary large end data sets divert them from that kind of close observation of production, of conditions of poverty, of labor markets, and so on? I think that's very, very important. So are there any implications for Africa? Fiona wanted me to talk about, and I think we have to be rather careful here, not get overexcited about extracting specific lessons. The context is so different, and the narrative in the book shows very clearly how decisions taken were rooted in and linked to highly specific Chinese history and experience. But what there is there are echoes. There are echoes in African experiences, plenty of things to provoke thought for policy officials. And of course, African countries have had their own rich, intense histories of policy debate. I've been very lucky to see fairly close up some of those debates in South Africa, in Mozambique, both of those in the early 1990s, and more recently in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a good example. There was a strong tradition of perhaps rather secretive, intense, internal debates over policy within the EPRDF, out of which would come strategic directions and shifts in emphasis, again, linked to political moments and so on. And there are really interesting parallels with the Chinese experience. When the Ethiopian government was considering a policy of creating industrial parks, which most of us know something about nowadays, its officials went on study tours. They tried to work out what made the difference between successes and failures across a range of industrial parks in China, Vietnam, Mauritius, Nigeria, and elsewhere. And that pragmatic approach to learning from experience elsewhere, but forging a specific Ethiopian policy, that was summarized rather nicely in a comment the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, made to one foreign academic, that he preferred the Sinatra model. They did it their way. The outcome of that can be debated. And then in South Africa, there was also, of course, a fierce debate over policy direction post-apartheid. And shall we say, the outcome was not quite the same as in China. And arguably the debate in South Africa is carried on unresolved really to this day, but I think I'd prefer other people to say more on that. What's really intriguing in all of this is the role, or one thing that's intriguing, not the most important thing maybe, but it's the role of foreign experts. What really matters in a way is which outsiders are invited in and given a hearing. Isabella highlights the role of a number of key ideologues of shock therapy, not least Milton Friedman, Janos Kornai, but she also shows how very different outsiders were involved. People like Alex Cairncross, whose own deep pragmatic experience of post-war reconstruction in the UK was invaluable to Chinese policy officials. And she shows very interestingly how some of the Eastern European economists visiting China shifted their views over time. Vladimir Bruce, for example. But there's also this interesting story, not remotely specific to China, of how coalitions formed. It wasn't simply outsiders as a bloc trying to win the argument. It was often this old strategy of, as she puts it, using a foreigner to enhance one's own position. You can see the same in Ethiopia, in Mozambique, in South Africa, and elsewhere. But what I think, if anything, really matters is it helps if policy officials have a range of external experiences and views, not just one. And I do know from experience that some foreign governments are very keen to encourage just the one, an overly narrow type of view of what should happen next. And one simple implication of all of that, maybe, is that we need more detailed histories inspired by books like Isabella's of these African policy debates. A really good example is by, sadly, the greatly missed late Vishnu Padiachi and Robbie van Niekerk, their book on South Africa, Shadow of Liberation. So there are examples, and I think we just need more of those. And before I stop and hand over, I'd like to just touch on a couple of more themes and questions very briefly. One, Isabella, is this right? One story seems to be that most of those responsible for a more gradual pace of reform, less beholden to mainstream shock therapy economics, actually subsequently faded into obscurity or exile in China. So is that right? And is it one more example of the extraordinary resilience of orthodox economics in the face of many realities? Another question is whether there's you actually did touch on this, you anticipated this. I wanted to ask you if there's a similar debate or if it takes a different form with huge global implications for energy and supply chains over energy production and pricing in China now. And I suppose a final question some might ask, given this is a book about prices, is what was the price paid in terms of inequality, environmental damage, social disruption, gendered relations and oppression for the path taken subsequently in the 90s and afterwards in China? And how is that debated nowadays? So I want to stop there. I want to congratulate Isabella on this book. I think people elsewhere, everywhere should read it. It's a fascinatingly told history on its own terms, but it gives us a lot of pause for thought on the value of taking evidence and experiment seriously and not being swayed by claims of ideal world models. And I will, and whilst it doesn't say that foreign experts are dangerous, far from it, it does say you should handle them with care. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was fantastic, and you had a pretty tall order for the task, but I think you've even exceeded. So yeah, thanks very much for those really insightful comments. Isabella, do you want to react, give some thoughts to the issues that Chris has raised before we take some of the questions which have been asked?
Let me start by thanking you for this really marvelous set of comments. This is the kind of comments that kind of make me realize more clearly what I did in the book. So thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. In reaction to the questions that you raised, which I think are brilliant and allow me to elaborate on some things that I didn't get to in the talk as I was trying to squeeze it all into half an hour. So yes, the gradualists in China that were important in the 1980s did in the majority disappear from the scene after 89, which was a result of them basically having risen through the support primarily of Zhao Ziyang, including others, but importantly of Zhao Ziyang. So they ended up standing in loyalty with Zhao Ziyang, and they ended up expressing publicly their sympathy with the demand of the protesters for dialogue with the leadership, which basically was some sort of a political suicide. So most of them ended up in exile. Some of the people that I interviewed actually spent time in prison in the 1990s. And some of them disappeared into private business and basically used their understanding of the emergent markets for private benefits. So in that sense, the most prevalent actors of the 80s that I've chronicled do disappear. However, I think that the dual track logic does not disappear, because 10 years into the reform that has created such a important institutional dynamic and vested interest within this reform approach, that it kind of regenerates itself in the 90s, even though some of the key actors that helped research it and systematize it in the 80s no longer played an important role. Of course, the battle intensifies in the 90s, and that is not least a result of the ways in which things played out in 89. But I would say that the gradualist voice does not disappear with the exile of certain specific people. Let me also point out, which is a curiosity that emerged in my research, that ironically, this disappearance of some of the key defenders of a pragmatist approach reoccurs throughout the cases that I have studied. Sang Hongyang is being, is basically being sacrificed, but his policies in ancient China are reestablished shortly after his death. John Kenneth Galbraith in the United States, completely different context, who is one of the key architects of the successful price control policy, towards the end, basically is forced to step down together with Leon Hendershot, succumbing to the pressures, even though their policy still continues, at least for a little time. So you have this repeated pattern where people who have defended such a pragmatist, experimentalist, marginalist, if you want, so marginalist in the sense of changing starting from the given realities, not in the sense of marginalist economics, as actors become extremely controversial. But given that their interventions are so close to the dynamics ingrained in the system, a lot of the policies that they help shape actually seem to, in these radically different contexts, seem to have survived to some extent, which is a curious thing that I did not expect to find at all. Okay, this brings me to the price paid in terms of the reforms. And the price is, of course, enormous. The price in terms of nature and environment and pollution and so on is enormous. And in fact, at that point, I would like to give a shout out to a book that was written in 1992, I believe, and translated into English in 2014 or so by Deng Yingtao, who was one of the reformers of the 80s, and who in the early 90s is warning that if China is going down a path of industrialization that basically emulates the patterns of the United States, that this would very quickly bring the world to the limits of what the environment can take, because China just is not the United States. It has many, many, many more people in relation to its landmass. It's just so much bigger in terms of, if you think in terms of per capita usage of resources, that it would very quickly create a situation where the world would be hitting its boundary. So this idea is certainly already around in the early 90s in China. And in some sense, it took until very recently, until this idea was being picked up in the policy discourse in a very meaningful way, I think, or in a big fashion. But the question is it too late to reverse, right? Is it like some 20, 30 years later, is it still possible, given that China is also locked into this enormously resource intensive kind of a model? Gender relations is certainly one of the darkest stories of the reform period. I mean, the reversal in gender relations in China is disheartening. There's in fact a scholar at the University of SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York, Buffalo. Her name is Dong Ige, who's just writing a paper on that in the 1980s, how the reversal of gender relations is starting to happen then, and how this is being reflected about, which I think will fill an enormously important gap. Now, to the question of China now and the energy situation and so on, let me say, I think it's a moving target. I've just started researching it. I'm just struck by the parallels where I read in the news that people say, oh, China now has liberalized its electricity price. And then one sentence later, the electricity price is now allowed to deviate by 20% up or down from the state set price, which is the exact same principle that I had on one of my slides in the 1980s. And then the next sentence is, oh, the Chinese state is mobilizing its coal reserves to push up the supply of coal in order to elevate the price squeeze that the electricity producers have experienced. China is also mobilizing state-owned coal producers to ramp up their production. Now, this is of course not going to solve the problem that we should be using less coal, but it does solve the problem of the the squeeze in the electricity sector and the shortages that have occurred, using the exact same logic that was mobilized in the 1980s. So in that sense, for these most upstream, most essential sectors, I think a lot of this logic of economic governance has prevailed very much under the radar of most observers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Isabella. And I think the exchange really added your depth to the discussions. So we're going to open up for any questions or comments. Please feel free to either post them in the chat function, or if you raise your hand using the raise hand icon at the bottom, you can also ask them verbally. So we have two questions which have been posted in the chat. One from Mohammed is around state-owned enterprises. I guess, Isabella, you won't be in a position probably to comment on state-owned enterprises in South Africa, which Mohammed is trying to draw you to comment on, but you might want to comment more broadly on state-owned enterprises, and perhaps anything on the developmental role of state-owned enterprises in a market economy, or anything which you would like to comment on that. And there's also a question from Zhu Cheng. I'm not sure whether everybody can see it, so I'll just summarize it. Acknowledging the great achievements of China, she would like to know your thoughts around the future of China, particularly in these times of the strained relationship between the US and China, and the fact that China is losing the benefits of population, the birth rate now being low, and rising labor costs. What should China do at the post stage of catch-up reform? So perhaps you could just respond on those.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, as Fiona already said, I clearly am not an expert of South African SOEs. In fact, I would like to ask back at what stage is the SOE reform debate in South Africa. Let me just make one very general observation, which is I think that in SOE reform, there has always been a tension between coming up with a new form of organization of enterprises, basically through institutional innovation, as opposed to making SOEs emulate what private companies do. And I think that this tension is in many ways ingrained in various phases of SOE reform in China, where some say that the state-owned asset administration is basically acting in the same way as a private stakeholder organization would be acting, whereas others would say that this is a completely different kind of system, and it's probably both. And the question is, what is it meant to be and where is it going? So in that sense, there's a lot of debate and a lot of tension within the Chinese system as well that I'm sure could inform, based on closer study, debates in the South African context. Well, the $1 million question of what is the future of China? I mean, I'm not in a position to really answer that question in the sense of giving you the analysis, a talk of what the trends will be. Let me just say that my impression is that the very major movements within the Chinese policy context that we have observed in the last year or so, that is the crackdown on major tech companies, that is the elevation of the principle of dual circulation and common prosperity, and of course also the turmoil in the real estate sector that is very much, I think, being let happen, indicate that China is at a point of recalibrating its own economic system, and that this recalibration is in response to these major challenges that have been pointed out in this question. And basically what I can say based on my research is that typically there's a pattern where there's initially big announcements with big policy slogans such as common prosperity, and then the impression emerges that this is a vacuous propaganda slogan. But basically what the vacuousness of this slogan in the first place indicates is that there is a consensus on the top of the leadership and within the party that a new direction is necessary. And there's a vague sense of what that direction should be. But how this direction is going to be achieved is then a matter of experimentation, of policy consultation, and so on. So this is really a call to the organizations and institutions within the Chinese system to think hard and address these questions that are being identified under the umbrella of common prosperity, and then come up with specific policies that address these challenges. So in that sense, I think what we are seeing is exactly such a remodeling under the umbrella of continuity, a remodeling in relation to some major issues. Where it's still hard, I think it's people ask me, what is common prosperity? I mean, we can give some broad definitions, but I think what it will really mean is simply still being worked out, and that will have enormous implications for questions such as how the Chinese economy will deal with the aging of its population, how it will deal with technological upgrading, with rising wages, and so on.
Thanks. And we have one more question from Bekele, who's asking, based on your research, what lessons do you have for other developing countries, especially in Africa, that would like to emulate China's development? I guess some of the comments from Chris also pertain to that. And probably the first is that there's no blueprint, but there might be some insights you would like to offer, Isabella?
Yeah, I mean, really just underscore what Chris already said. I think it's basically a message of there is no simple fix. There is no magic bullet. Whether it's the Washington or the Beijing consensus, it won't solve it all. So the task is really to study carefully what the local conditions are and how foreign experiences can help avoid pitfalls, as well as inform certain local policy decisions, but not by copying, but rather by adaptation to the prevailing local conditions. In that sense, I mean, Chris hinted at that. Yes, I do see my book as absolutely complementary to the work of Yuan Ang. In fact, I mean, my book is based on the dissertations. I had already worked out most of it before her book came out. And when I read it, I was like, oh, this is brilliant. She's like getting at this from this political science, development policy type of perspective. And I'm getting at this from intellectual history, economic history kind of perspective. But at the end of the day, we kind of converge towards the same message, that is, understand your local institutions and conditions not simply as a drawback and something that needs to be first corrected in order to then create growth, but think of them as the assets that you have and ask yourself, what can you do with them, right? So in that context, I actually think that one more broad insight that might follow from the connection between the 1940s and the 1980s in the Chinese context, and this is something that Elizabeth Perry and Sebastian Heilmann in their work on policymaking in China have been pointing out, is that there is an inspiration in the ways in which Chinese leaders are redesigning policies from guerrilla warfare, which is based on the principle of taking advantage of your knowledge of the local situation, right, and exploiting that exact knowledge in face of overwhelming power that is institutionalized and that draws on overwhelmingly powerful organizations and systems and so on. But you can only win in guerrilla warfare by exploiting exactly that advantage, right? And in some sense, I think maybe one of the insights from the research that I've done is that this logic of strategizing in guerrilla warfare can be something that can inspire the ways in which we think about development.
Thanks, Isabella. I guess we will have to leave it there in terms of comments and questions. I see Don has requested, please leave the link up. It will be on our YouTube channel where we were broadcasting. It will be saved there. And I know that on Isabella's website, if you Google it, she has videos there too. A dozen or so other talks, perhaps on different angles. But thanks, Don, for the comment. And for those who haven't yet ordered the book and would like to do so, on the flyer for this webinar, there's a link to ordering it with a 30% discount code from the publisher. So we will have to leave it there. Thanks very much again, Isabella, for the talk. It's never the same just reading a book as actually hearing from the author's own mouth some of the distilled insights from it. So thank you very much, and to Chris for the really thoughtful and pertinent comments, and also for drawing some of the links for Africa, even though they are certainly not straightforward. So thank you for all of those who have participated and attended, and goodbye for now.
And thanks to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Bye.